Monitor vCenter and administer alarms. Oh, so I guess you could probably call this nugget miscellaneous. There are a bunch of extra settings in vCenter that we haven't touched on yet because you've probably interacted with them. You've probably played with them before. Things like resource maps here in the server service and host agent views. You might have even played around with vCenter alarms. In fact, you've probably seen a number of vCenter alarms that have appeared in the demo as I've gone through clicking through various items. If you've been concerned, as you've been watching all of these videos and been thinking, wow, there's a lot of red and yellow lights that have been appearing on Greg's screen, you got to figure too that we are trying to run what is effectively three separate vCenter servers or ESX servers in a single workstation atop VMware workstation. So a lot of these alarms you're seeing just simply because the performance just isn't there. In a production environment, a lot of the red and the yellow dots, number one, you aren't just going to see as many of them, and number two, you'll probably eventually have them tuned appropriately so they make sense for whatever your actual problem thresholds are. Now, I call this nugget miscellaneous because we have to talk about the vCenter server settings, and I want to show you some of the scheduled tasks, and I want to just kind of peek into resource maps just simply because I think they're really cool. Then we want to take a look at the server and agent statuses. All these are sort of monitoring elements that will help you understand what the configuration and the behaviors are in your environment. And then lastly, we'll pop over here into the vCenter alarms and show you how you can configure those alarms and their triggers, because you will probably need to tune them a little bit for what sorts of behaviors your hardware presents into vCenter. The default alarms by themselves are not terribly noisy, but there are a couple of them in there that you may want to disable just to get rid of the red dots and the yellow dots that don't make any sense for what you're trying to do. I do want to start, however, with just a short look here at some of the vCenter server settings and some of these other configurations that I mentioned are kind of miscellaneous, but definitely important. We've been working here in the vSphere client for a long period of time throughout this whole series, but what we haven't really spent much time with yet is actually configuring the actual vSphere basic parameters. And I leave this to last because in a way you have to understand a lot about vCenter and what all the things do and how they interrelate before a lot of these vCenter server settings really make sense. We've seen some of these before just simply because I've popped in here really quickly so you could take a look through licensing, for example. But I want to go step down through these elements here to give you an idea of what the server settings are and where you may want to make some adjustments to them to make your whole experience just a little bit better. Now, I've talked about licensing. There's no sense in talking again about licensing here. The one setting here that is terribly important is this one called statistics. And when you're popping through and taking a look at your different performance statistics and all the just characteristics of your vCenter environment, these statistics are important. They are effectively a series of roll-ups of that performance information so that as you go backwards in time, you get less detail to the performance information. Okay, it's probably better if instead of explaining this from this location, if we actually go to our cluster and take a look at performance on our cluster. So this is the performance tab. This tab will eventually, as it gathers the one-day summary, give you an idea of what some of the basic characteristics are, the behaviors of the virtual machines and the hosts that make up this cluster. So I've got some CPU information here. I've got some memory utilization in here. These are sort of the basic views that I can see. If I want to get more complex, then I have to move into the advanced view here. And what the advanced view does is it opens up the entirety of all the different metrics. If you've played with perfmon in Windows before, this is the equivalent of perfmon, except it's quite a bit more comprehensive because instead of just giving you the performance statistics of a specific host, you're getting performance statistics across hosts and virtual machines and entire clusters all wrapped up into one tidy package. What types of exposure that you get, so the objects that are going to be available to you are really going to be based on at what location in vCenter's little tree view there are you actually attempting to view performance. Because I've looked at the performance chart here within the cluster, the object that we're going to be looking at for performance is indeed the cluster. If I go down into the virtual machine, then that object may be the virtual machine. But I can see things like CPU information and cluster services information. I can see memory information in here, virtual machine operations. This is good to know. How often do things, different virtual machine options actually occur on those systems? If I dig over here into specific virtual machines then and take a look at performance again, I can actually pull up some more, arguably more useful information here about, again, CPU and memory utilization, but disk information and data store information and network and power and system information, these sorts of things. And you'll notice here that the objects are a bit different as well. So these are performance charts that you will probably find yourself using whenever you're out attempting to actually figure out why certain behaviors are occurring in the way that they are. There's a button down here that allows you to manage some chart settings. In other words, what sorts of selections that are there. And you can also save those chart settings if you want after you've created them. But recognize that these performance charts, they're there. They provide the level of detail that you're looking for. But as you can imagine, that's a lot of data to keep around. You know, if I'm trying to keep around what went on between 12:30 p.m. and 12:40 p.m. for the next year or more, that's arguably a ridiculous amount of data to be kept. And so what vCenter Server does with the statistics node here is it provides a way to create these roll-ups. The argument is that if I'm trying to figure out the difference between my CPU utilization from a year ago and today, I probably don't care what happened 9 months, 17 days, 4 hours, and 16 minutes ago, and 17 minutes ago. So the minute-by-minute information is less important to me when it's way far in the past than is the day-by-day information when it's way far in the past. So you can see here I have an interval duration. So for every 5 minutes of data, I keep that for a day. For every 30 minutes of data, I keep that for a week. For every 2 hours of data for a month, and for every day, I keep it for a year. So you can see that the further back I go, the less granular the data that I have. Also is a statistics level for these different roll-ups and what in terms you want to keep. The statistics level by default is level 1. But there are 4 different levels of statistics here. You can see level 1 is just the basic metrics. Level 2 adds in some additional information. If I go all the way up to level 4, well, it's essentially, you could call it debugging information. And so keeping a higher level of information essentially means that you have to store more data. However, you may find that this data is useful for you in the short term, whereas as you get further and further out, that degrading quantity or degrading granularity of data mindset means that you just don't really care anymore. So you can adjust these statistics how you see fit. I'm going to leave these for 1, but you might actually just take a look and see, well, where do you want to edit what types of data you're going to keep for? What is the interval, and then how long do you want to keep that data? If you believe you're going to need more than 5-minute granularity to your data for over a day, well, then go ahead and increase that amount. You are going to have an impact on the database size then, right? So if I try to keep, instead of my 1-day interval for a year, if I try to keep it for 2 years, well, as you can see here, my estimated space goes up by a little bit, about 4 gigs there. Change that from level 1 to level 2 information, and, well, it's just not going to work for me. I can't keep level 4 information when I'm blowing it away at earlier points in time. So all of this is going to have an impact on the amount of data that you're having to keep and the database size that you're going to have to keep in order to support that. This is just one of the items in here. We have runtime settings as well. These runtime settings help you identify what the unique identifier is for the vCenter server. If there's a managed IP address in here, server name. You generally don't touch these at all. These unique IDs are in here. Generally, if you have multiple instances, they're going to operate in the same environment. So you're going to want to have a different number for the other vCenter server than would you for this one. Any Active Directory queries are going to have a timeout of 60 seconds. Is there a query limit? Is there a validation period for that information? You'll notice here that the query limit is set to 5,000 users and groups. So if you attempt to try to gather a bunch of stuff, well, are you going to try to constrain yourself or not? Common thing to do, especially in very large environments. If you set up alerting, You're going to have to put up an SMTP server here and a sender account so that you can send those alerts out to individuals. If I have SNMP also, I can set up one of 4 different receivers, including the URL and the community string that is used for sending that SNMP data from vCenter to your SNMP server. The ports here are generally not touched at all, and generally your timeout settings aren't going to be touched at all. You can, however, adjust what the logging level is for vCenter if you find that you're experiencing problems that you really can't track down. Okay, by default, we're actually a fairly decent amount of logging. It's all the way up to information level logging. If you get down into verbose and trivia, I will warn you that doing so can have a negative impact, because just keeping that verbose and trivia level logging, lot of effort, lot of resources that are required in order to support that. So pay attention to this and adjust this only if you're finding that you're experiencing problems. If you do need or if your environment starts getting very large, or if you have a larger number of administrators that are coming in, you may need to increase the number of database connections between vCenter and its database. And you may also desire to call your tasks and events from your database. Good idea generally, because these tasks, unless you are under audit control and your auditors are going to want to see these forever, calling these just shrinks the database. Now there are 2 other settings down here. We've seen these before, the SSL settings and the advanced settings item down here. You probably aren't going to change that much in this advanced settings screen. I mean, if somebody tells you to, if somebody over at the VMware, if their tech support instructs you to do this, or if you read something online that may make sense for what you need to do, you might adjust this. I really doubt it, though. What I do want to take a look at or show you is this whole notion of tasks and events, and really how it relates to scheduled tasks. Throughout this whole series, right, we've been enacting change in this vCenter environment. When we enact change, well, each time we click on something, that generates a task, and then an event is something that's kicked back at us as something that occurs. Now, you can see these things. If we go back here to tasks and events, here are the tasks that were accomplished. I turned on fault tolerance. I started fault tolerance. I powered on a VM, these sorts of things. And here are the details associated with that view. And there are some events that can occur here that relate to, well, what happened as we were going about doing those things. So there are tasks and there are events. But what is kind of buried in this screen here is this whole scheduled task link up here in the upper right. Remember, a task is any time I click on something, and an event is anything that happens perhaps as a result of it or perhaps not. But there comes the time sometimes when I may actually want to schedule a task for execution at some point in the future. Okay, here are 3 that are here by default based off of the things we've done thus far. Schedule compliance check for the profile, update manager, update download, the check notification here. And if I want, I can adjust some of the settings here for these items by adjusting what's the start time and when do I want it to run. Very simple. No different here than how you've been dealing with scheduled tasks in, for example, Windows. Now, if I want to create a new one here, you'll see that there's a fairly limited list of the things that we can do. Remediate, scan for updates, create a snapshot of the VM, add a host. So let's say, I don't know, you want to one day change the VM power state on a VM. And you know that you want to do it at 11 p.m. tonight. Well, you can go through here with these tasks and identify what you want to do. I want to power off this VM, and I want to give it a task name of power me down. And I want to do it one time. I want to do it later tonight at 11 p.m. Done. Also want to notify myself by sending an email to a following address when the task is complete with all the status information. So all that this is a mechanism for you to push stuff into the future, different actions that you want to accomplish at some point in the future. Will you be using this that often? You might. If you go here to New, you'll see down here at the bottom the scan for updates and remediate tasks. These can actually be useful, particularly if you migrate virtual machines around. So you migrate all the virtual machines off and you scan and remediate the hosts. This might actually simplify that whole host patching process. And you might be able to set up a very nice set of tasks that ultimately allow you to patch machines while you're not around. I don't know. But all these are there for you. Use them if you feel like you would like them. I want to show you one other cool piece in here. And this is, as I said, this is kind of the miscellaneous nugget here. So when I show you this, what I'm really doing is showing you just this because I think it's fundamentally cool. If I take a look at our cluster here, in fact, I'll do the entire data center, and I scroll over to the right, you'll see there's this item here called maps. And maps just are cool. Like, I've always been a big fan of maps, but they come in really handy in this whole vCenter world because of all the different interconnections that occur. So if I'm just looking at, for example, my host, the connections between my host to my VMs, well, you can see here the very complex web of different connections that are required. So here are the other options that are shown. If I add in the networks and the data stores and apply relationships, you can see here that just for 3 servers and what was it, 6 VMs, the various interconnections that are required in order to keep the whole thing up and running. These come in handy from time to time whenever you're having a problem identifying if whether or not a host is properly configured or not. What you get here is just a basic logical linkage between different elements to identify whether or not they're attached or not. And you gotta kind of take these with a grain of salt, right? Because, well, ESX2 is connected to VM Data Store 2. You don't know anything else. You just know that it is. Except it's just nice to know, right? A very quick glance at a map like this can help you figure out, oh, wait a minute, I forgot to hook up Data Store 3. So then I can go and solve the problem down that way. This is one of the areas that is a good source or a good resource for some high-level knowledge about the health of your system. But there are actually 2 other locations where you can get some really useful health-based information about vCenter and also your ESX hosts. The first is right here under Administration, and if we go to, I believe it is vCenter Service Status here. Now what is this? This is really a roll-up. It's kind of, if you're familiar with application performance management, there's a very APM-oriented approach to rolling up a series of monitors that exist across all the different functionalities that make up vCenter. This is the vCenter part of this. Okay, so license services and vCenter Server and the Service Manager and Inventory Service, and this is the pieces that lay on top of ESX. And as you can see here, all of these have, and I've identified, well, what's the health of that? Replication health, good. All right, we're great. Capacity usage tracking service, good, we're great. VMware Update Manager, good, we're great. And so all of these will provide you essentially what you need to know about all the different services that have been hooked into vCenter. If you want to just show errors, well, you can click that and see the errors. But if you want to be confirmed that all the services are working just fine, you can click that there as well. These run every so often. You can click the refresh button to rerun it if you want. But this gives you that nice warm fuzzy that your vCenter environment is, well, it's all healthy, right? Now, as I said, this is just for the vCenter piece. There's also another piece of this that as it relates to the ESX hosts as well. So my 3 hosts here, right? Here's 1, 2, and 3. And if I want to actually take a look at what's going on the individual ESX hosts, what I'm looking for is, in fact, what I've already brought forward here called hardware status. Now, these hardware status views are really, really nifty, actually. And I can view the sensors or the alerts and the warnings or the system event log if you want. I find the sensors to be particularly interesting because if I show all of the sensors, I can actually see which of these sensors have been enabled for which of the physical components that are attached into these hosts. So here's my processor sensors, right? For CPU 0 and 1, both of them are showing normal right now. That's good. If I go down here, if I had memory sensors, I would see those, or PCI sensors. I think there's another one down here somewhere. But these sensors provide a mechanism for you to understand whether or not the hardware pieces on the ESX servers are actually running or not. You can update them, you can reset them if you want. Again, these provide the same purpose as does the other one for vCenter, the vCenter service view, so that you can identify, well, wait a minute, maybe I've got a processor problem here. Maybe there's something very low level that I couldn't be able to know if I had to dig through all the logs and figure out what was going on with all the logs. So both of these tools, fantastic for helping you identify high-level problems. Now, these aren't going to help you with necessarily behavioral type problems. Okay, if you're losing a processor, well, that's a fairly, I guess I should say, that's a very low-level problem. And the sensor is going to alert you that that's the case. But over time, as your your assets, your virtual assets, are doing what it is they do, well, the behaviors need to be alerted on as well. If I don't know, if a virtual machine starts sucking up more of your available IOPS for your storage than it really should, well, you want to know about that because it might not be doing it right now, but it might be doing it overnight. That's why you keep seeing all these yellow and red sort of boxes or little indicators that I've kind of been purposely ignoring because, to be honest, in this demo environment, a lot of these alerts just pop up when they're not really alerts. They're just alerts because some of the error messages have been tuned such that it doesn't really belong inside of this demo environment. Once you get into production, a lot of these error messages are going to go away. A couple of examples. So I've had this little yellow triangle here that I've kind of quietly been not showing you. And the reason here is because under configuration issues, I see that this host currently has no management network redundancy. Right? If I go to my configuration and I take a look at networking here, even though I've moved over this physical adapter onto the distributed switch, I only have one physical adapter that's currently plugged into this VM kernel port for the purposes of management. It's just that one adapter right there. And so what this is doing is it's alerting me to let me know that, well, if I lose that adapter, because it's not redundant, if I lose that adapter, I may potentially end up in an isolation situation. So useful here. The other one here, remember when back when we were working with host profiles? Well, this host is not in compliance with the profile that it's been attached to. And so this gives me a nice warm fuzzy that there are a couple of issues that I might want to go check out. I want to get rid of the items in this box so that my machines are working just fine. I go down here to My App. I can find out perhaps there's another error message in here. Aha, the VMware Tools is not running because it's not installed. And if you remember, when we created My App VM1, we didn't actually install an operating system, which is why there's no VMware Tools here. So all of these are consolidated down here at the bottom in this list of alarms. And they give you, again, a really good view of the behaviors of your environment over an extended period of time, because when an alarm kicks up, you're going to need to go and acknowledge that alarm at some point. Right? Acknowledging the alarm essentially says, all right, I understand that something is going on. You can go away now. So useful information here. Now, admittedly, though, these triggered alarms, they're useful, but they're useful when they make sense. The alarms that make sense for my environment may not necessarily make sense for your environment. I may be okay with 90% utilization on, I don't know, some resource. You may be a little bit more concerned about that resource. You may want to dial it down. Or you may just be one of those admins that are like, hey, I don't want alarms, so I just want to tune these things so I don't have to deal with them anymore. The opportunity is yours. The Alarms tab up here is where all these alarms are identified, and ultimately where their definitions can be made. You'll see I have triggered alarms here and definitions. Now, here's where people get tripped up with these alarms. Okay, we were looking at, what was that alarm here? I don't know, I'll pick one. So my CPU usage on a virtual machine is too high. Common problem. And I got a backup job is kicking up the CPU, or my antivirus, or somebody sent a dirty email to Exchange, and so everybody's trying to get their copy of that dirty email. And when that happens, the CPU of that server skyrockets, and I get an alarm. Now, maybe I don't really care about that alarm, so I want to view the settings of that alarm. And I go, okay, well the trigger is this usage is above 75%. Wait a minute, 75%, that's pretty low. Even 90% is pretty low for my alerts because, I don't know, somebody sends dirty emails out in Exchange all the time and it doesn't cause a problem or whatever. So you might want to go and tune these. It's an activity you should want to do. But you notice how all these are grayed out here. I can't really adjust these things. And the reason for that is because the alarm was defined down here in vc.company.pri, which is the top level in the tree, right? The top level area. Alarm settings are read-only, except when accessed to the object where they were defined. So even though you can see the definitions here, and you could create a new alarm here if you wanted to, you're not going to be able to actually adjust the ones that were defined further up in the tree. Let me go up here in the tree here, and let me go to alarms and definitions here, and you'll see I got a whole boatload of alarms right here. Shoot. So with these alarms, okay, I can now identify which alarm I want to adjust. Let me see if that virtual machine one is here. Virtual machine CPU usage. Let me right click and choose edit settings. Aha! All of the settings now are available for me to change. I can choose even to just simply disable the alarm if I don't want to see it. And in fact, I will show you where I've cheated here. A couple of these I've actually disabled just because I was trying to get rid of some of the alarms, particularly earlier on in this series when you weren't really as familiar with your environment as you are now. So let's adjust this settings here. So I want to monitor virtual machines, specific conditions. I want to adjust the trigger here because maybe 95 that's too low. Maybe 90 is too low. Maybe 95 is better. And my warning, I'm going to bump it up to 85. It's just what I think I should do. I could also add an additional condition here by clicking the Add button. Oops, sorry, too many times. By clicking the Add button and adjusting what this trigger type is. So there's a whole boatload of trigger types in here that I could adjust. And then I have some minimal capacity for doing ands and ors over here. All right. Once that alarm triggers, what do I want to do? Okay. When do I want to report on it? So repeat the triggered alarm when the condition exceeds the range or every 5 minutes. And then ultimately, what do I want to do here under actions? Now, I love this little screen, and I love how that VMware has actually created this screen because it's very, very logical. So if I have the action that I want to do, I don't know, send a notification email, or when the VM gets to be too much processor usage, just power it off. I don't do that, but you could. Let's say send a notification email, and I'll punch in whatever the configuration is there. I have 4 different settings changes or state changes that determine when I would do that. Okay, when I go from green to yellow, yellow to red, and then red to yellow and yellow to green. So as I'm moving up or down in the uh-oh meter here, from I'm okay to something's not good to uh-oh, something's really bad, and then back down again, for each one of those state changes, I can adjust whether I want to set it up once or whether I want to set it up multiple times. So useful tool. I love these alarms because computers are deterministic. Right? You've got to do something to a computer or a scheduled processes to do something to a computer for it to use more resources or change a state or really misbehave. And so if you have these alarms really well designed, if you've done a really good job of identifying these alarms, the ones that make sense for you, even adding in some new ones if you feel like, that can go a long way into ensuring that you are providing the best performance for the virtual machines that you have. These alarms, when you mate them together with the performance information that you have, are going to really ensure that you're doing a good job of making sure that those VMs behave appropriately. And if you go and delete them all or disable them like I did in your production environment, just don't do that, okay? So what have we talked about in this nugget? We've talked about the very miscellaneous topics associated with vCenter and administering alarms. We talked about the server settings. We talked about the scheduled tasks and the maps and how maps are just cool. We talked about the kind of APM-like roll-up and roll-down charts that we get with the vCenter server service and host agent status. And then we spent some fun time there looking at alarms, alarm triggers, and actions. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.